Thank you all for enduring my long biography. I'm really grateful to Stephen and all his staff and volunteers for having me here. It's a fantastic conference. So many interesting speakers. I'm really thrilled to be on the agenda with distinguished scientists such as James Hansen and amazing advocates and authors such as David Wallinga, who was here on stage with me last night, and also Carrie Gillum, who I think may already have spoken. So, see if I can master the, there we go. How are we doing? Yes? Good, thank you. Okay, all right. So what I'm going to talk about is how we created the system of meat production that we have today, which, for anyone who's a meat eater, plays such a large role in all of our diets and lives, and even for those who are not meat eaters, influences so many of the consumer products that permeate our society that have a meat origin. And this is a question that, as you could hear in my bio, I've been kind of obsessed with for a number of years. I've been writing about antibiotic resistance for at least 10 years now, and 2 books of my 3. And I came to this story of the influence of antibiotics in agriculture through writing about the problem of antibiotic resistance in medicine and coming to understand that our use of antibiotics in livestock dwarfs what we use in medicine every year. So it turns out that our modern system of producing the meat that we eat owes its existence to 2 things: to antibiotics and to chickens. So antibiotics are the foundation of modern meat production. Since the 1950s, all around the world, we've been feeding livestock tiny doses of antibiotics on most days of their lives, not to cure them from diseases, which is the way we use antibiotics in humans, but to make livestock grow more quickly and to protect them against diseases that arise in crowded barns and feedlots. We do that for cattle, we do it for pigs, but we did it first in chickens. In effect, poultry taught the rest of meat agriculture how to misuse antibiotics. And in some parts of the world, chicken and chicken producers are reversing that historic mistake and teaching the rest of livestock agriculture how to back away from overuse of antibiotics. So I'm going to take us through that history because it's a story that contains so many mistakes that we still make today. Mistakes of trusting too much in technology, of failing to ask questions of science, of assuming there's only one path to progress, and especially of taking things for granted. And in this story, the thing that we take for granted the most is antibiotics. And there's a thing that I think we all forget, which is that antibiotics are a pretty recent arrival. Depending on when you start counting, the antibiotic era begins either in 1928, when Alexander Fleming leaves a window open in his laboratory in London and penicillium mold wafts in and contaminates the culture plates he's working on. Or in 1941, when the compound secreted by that mold, the first natural penicillin, gets given to a human for the first time. But either way, the antibiotic era is not that old. It's either 90 years old or 77 years old. It is within longer than the lifetimes of everyone in this room. And so for us, antibiotics have always been there. We have no sense of how extraordinary and how precious they are because we've never had to live without them. We've forgotten what our grandparents knew, which is that life without antibiotics, without guaranteed protection from the ravages of infection, was often tragic and was always uncertain. In the time of our grandparents and our great-grandparents, surgery and childbirth and accidents, it was routine for them to be fatal. So were random injuries, childhood illnesses, and as this 1930 advertisement from a magazine shows you, something as simple as cutting yourself while shaving could put you in the hospital with a fatal infection. So we're now running up against the unintended consequences of failing to treat antibiotics with the seriousness that they deserve. Worldwide, the power of antibiotics is failing against resistance. The former Secretary General of the United Nations called antibiotic resistance the greatest and most urgent global threat. The Chief Medical Officer of the United Kingdom has said that antibiotic resistance is as serious a threat to society as terrorism. And the former head of the CDC here in the US refers to the bacteria that become resistant as nightmares. We're losing the power of antibiotics because by misusing them and overusing them, we've allowed the bacterial world to adapt to them. And one of the most important ways that we've done that is in agriculture. So I'm going to tell you the story of how that happened. It begins with this chap. He is a scientist named Thomas Jukes. He was an emigre from England. He migrated through Canada to the United States. He became an expert in the dietary needs of chickens. And on Christmas Day, 1948, he walked into his laboratory, which was not very far from here, outside New York City, to check the results of an experiment. He was working for a pharmaceutical firm named Letterly Laboratories that had just made one of the first antibiotics, the first of the tetracycline class, a drug called chlorotetracycline. So Jukes had set up what was kind of a traditional experimental design. He had taken a bunch of just hatched baby chickens, and he divided them up into groups. And he wanted to test the power of dietary supplements for livestock. So to each of those groups, he gave some supplement that was on the market at the time. Vitamins, cod liver oil, brewer's yeast, and to one group, he gave the dried, ground-up remains of the manufacturing waste from making his company's drug. When he weighed the chicks a few weeks later on Christmas Day, he did it himself because he'd given his lab tech the day off for the holiday. He discovered that the birds who'd received the antibiotic leftovers weighed more than any other bird in the experiment, twice as much as birds that got what was the standard diet for chickens at the time. Jukes called this effect growth promotion. And he realized pretty quickly, though he didn't admit to it for a while in public, that what was creating the effect was tiny doses of his company's antibiotic, which was left behind in the manufacturing waste when the drug was strained out and bottled for sale. And with that recognition, he created a new industry. In just 5 years, farmers in the United States went from giving their livestock no antibiotics at all to giving them 500,000 pounds a year. And today, just in the US, the total use of antibiotics is more than 30 million pounds a year. And across the world, the total is believed to be more than 260 million pounds on a global average, at least twice as much antibiotic going into livestock as being given to people to cure infections. And here's the important point about this. Unlike in human medicine, almost none of the antibiotics going into livestock are going to them to cure illness. These animals are not sick. The drugs are being given to them for Jukes' effect of growth promotion, and also to protect them from catching diseases in crowded barns and feedlots. The reason that's important is that whenever we use an antibiotic, in agriculture or in medicine, we're taking a risk that bacteria will adapt to the drugs. We balance that risk against the benefit of curing an infection. When we cure the infection, the risk is worthwhile. When there is no infection present, we tip the balance of that equation entirely over to the risk of encouraging resistance. And that's what we've been doing for decades when we give antibiotics routinely to the animals that we eat. So I came out of doing this work out of a couple of years of talking to people about the impact of antibiotic resistance in medicine, talking to physicians and researchers, people who'd had drug-resistant infections, families of children who did not survive infections. And I was shocked by how casually we were using antibiotics in agriculture when medicine exerts such tight control. And I wanted to know, where did this come from? How did we get here? To answer that question, it turned out I had to go back to the beginning of the antibiotic era, which happens to be the end of World War II. So Fleming's penicillin, to give you a bit of history, is the first antibiotic, and its first wide use is on the battlefields of World War I. It gets rolled out in 1943, and because of that drug, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors come home at the end of the war who otherwise would have died. When it's rolled out to civilians on the open market a year or two later, people who would have died terrible, lingering deaths from infection are saved in days. Sometimes it seems like they're cured in hours. There's a reason why antibiotics were called initially the miracle drugs. Their effect seemed like a miracle. So right after penicillin comes streptomycin and chloramphenicol and Jukes' tetracycline, followed by another tetracycline made by Pfizer really quickly. All the foundational drugs of the antibiotic era, all by 1948. There is crazy enthusiasm for them. That renders them both a public good and also, for those manufacturers, an instant, huge moneymaker. And manufacturers' desire to squeeze just a little more profit out of this magic new product dovetails in a really interesting way with other things that are going on at the end of World War II. So during the war, the meat industry was encouraged by governments to spool up production as much as possible to feed all those millions of soldiers and sailors deploying all around the world. But when the war was over, that guaranteed market went away. And that left the meat industry with all this new infrastructure that they had built out and no sales that were guaranteed to them by the military coming back to compensate them for that investment. And at the same time, because of the devastation of the war, there was a huge amount of concern about the food supply being more fragile than anyone had anticipated. If you think about it, arable land had been destroyed by battles, flocks and herds had been decimated. There weren't even fishing fleets to take protein out of the ocean because so many fishing vessels had been co-opted by national navies to compensate for boats that had been sunk. There were crop failures in Europe and Asia, and even here in the US, there was what came to be called a meat famine. That was such an important news story that it actually played a role in the first election after the war in 1946. So the food supply feels fragile. The food industry feels overextended. Their answer to both of those is to try to cut their costs, to retreat from the amount of infrastructure they had been supporting. Their easy answer to that is to start giving livestock cheaper feed. This is the moment at which we start raising livestock on grains instead of on pasture. In the case of chickens, the heroes of my story, or maybe the anti-heroes, they turn from giving them small pulverized fish from the California coast, the subject of John Steinbeck's book, Cannery Row, to giving them instead grains. But grains don't have all the nutrition that chickens need, and therefore they turn to looking for supplements to add back the nutrition they're missing, but the supplements have to be cheap. And that's what brings Jukes into his laboratory in 1948 on Christmas Day, and what spurs the enormous use of antibiotics in livestock from that moment and up till today. Jukes fed his birds something that his company was going to throw away. It was literally money for nothing. And by the time antibiotics became expanded around the world, and they discovered that these doses were so small, grams per ton, It was a very inexpensive way to influence the growth of livestock from that point and up until today. So all of that story makes perfect sense, and yet at the same time I find it incredible because what they were doing completely ignored the context around the discovery of antibiotics as miracle drugs. This is Alexander Fleming, the father of penicillin and effectively the grandfather of all the antibiotics that come after. He had already warned against antibiotics being overused at the point at which Jukes started his experiment. In 1945, Fleming and his collaborators got the Nobel Prize in Medicine for the discovery of penicillin. And with getting the Nobel Prize comes going to Scandinavia and giving a speech. And Fleming could have chosen to use that speech to boast, to thank his collaborators. Instead, he chose to deliver a warning. And this is what he said. That if we used antibiotics in doses that were too small to cure an infection, we would allow bacteria to adapt to the drugs. An antibiotic resistance, the loss of the power of antibiotics, would result. Now, Fleming was talking about people taking low doses of antibiotics. He wasn't talking about agriculture. I think it would have been literally unimaginable to him that his precious miracle drugs would have been fed to livestock. And yet, just 3 years after he said this, Jukes set up his experiment. And Fleming was right, because 2 years after he made this speech, penicillin-resistant staph bacteria, a thing that had never before existed in the world, arose in hospitals in England. By the early 1950s, it moved around the world to Australia. By 1955, it arrived here on the west coast of the United States, caused a massive outbreak in the largest public hospital in Seattle, and then moved across the country, triggering a panicked summit meeting at Case Western Reserve in which people lamented that they had lost the power of antibiotics and they couldn't understand how the miracle drugs had lost their power that fast. No one seems to have considered, while this was happening, that the same processes that undermined antibiotics in medicine would do exactly the same thing when antibiotics were misused on farms. So growth promoter antibiotics, those tiny doses added to feed, they were patented by Jukes' company, Letterly, very quickly. They were licensed by the FDA in 1951. They became a routine part of the business of farming. And because they were an enormous moneymaker as well, they were quickly copied by the other nascent pharma companies. And some of those were names that we would still recognize today, like Pfizer and Merck. This is an ad that Merck ran in an agricultural journal in the mid-1950s, boasting about how its drug allowed juicier drumsticks to make it to consumers. Here's another ad. This was published in another agricultural journal by Jukes' company, Letterly, which later became American Cyanamid. This ad documents what happens next. First, those tiny doses were used just for growth promotion to make animals put tasty muscle mass on more quickly and less expensively. Then the doses were raised just a little bit because someone figured out that if you routinely fed antibiotics to animals, you could prevent them from catching diseases. Those two discoveries create the meat system that we have today, a very intensive production of animals in relatively small spaces. And I just want to emphasize again, both of these things, growth promotion and preventive dosing, they're unique to agriculture. We don't use antibiotics this way in people. If we did, we would consider it inappropriate. We would consider it against medical practice. We would understand that it contributes to antibiotic resistance. We only use antibiotics in people to cure infections. Growth promoters and preventive dosing don't affect a cure. And there were, at the time, astonishingly to me, there were only a few lonely voices that warned that this was a mistake. This is one example. This is a speech that I found deep in some archives in England made by a female scientist in the early 1960s at a meeting in England, warning that if we continued to misuse antibiotics in agriculture, antibiotic resistance would result. And of course, she wasn't listened to. And of course, she was right. The situation that Fleming had already correctly predicted in medicine began to happen in agriculture as well. Resistant bacteria arising from the misuse of antibiotics, and something that had never before been seen in the world, antibiotic-resistant foodborne illness. So if you look back at the histories, the first sign of trouble was in dairy production. Farmers were dosing their cows with so much penicillin that children who drank milk came down with penicillin allergies, even if they'd never taken the drug. Their first dose of penicillin for an ailment introduced allergies, because an allergic attack, because they'd already been primed by drinking milk. Then cheesemakers complained that they could no longer make cheese because there was so much antibiotic in the milk they got from dairies that it killed the beneficial bacteria that they used. And then there were the first outbreaks. First, an outbreak of drug-resistant salmonella all across southeastern England among people with no family and no household connection to each other. Almost 100 people were made sick, and 6 of them died. And then there was an outbreak in one town in the north of England, in Yorkshire. Drug-resistant E. coli this time. 13 of the town's children died. Even today, we would think that was a dramatic outbreak. In the late 1960s, that was catastrophic. And here's what happened as a result. That outbreak so shocked the United Kingdom that it became the first government anywhere to do something about farm antibiotic use. In the way that governments do, they put together a commission, which traveled up and down the UK and interviewed farmers and researchers. And after 2 years, the commission put out this report. It has a very long title, but it's come down to us as the Swan Report, after the name of the head of the commission. But what they said, which was really remarkable, was that the UK ought to outlaw the use of Jukes' growth promoters because they were harming human health. And somewhat to everyone's shock, the UK government agreed. In 1971, the UK Parliament became the first government anywhere in the world to place curbs on farm antibiotic use. Really an extraordinary thing to have done. And then, pretty reasonably, attention turned to the United States. At the time, the dominant agricultural power in the world and the place where growth promoters had first been identified and first really spooled out across all of agriculture. What were we going to do? In 1976, this scientist, Stuart Levy, who was and is still now faculty at Tufts University outside Boston, he did an experiment that was so beautifully constructed that no one has ever repeated it because no one had to. It was so clear. He proved that the concerns behind the British government's ban on growth promoter antibiotics were absolutely reasonable and ought to be listened to, and he did it by setting up a model farm. He found a family outside Boston that lived on a property that had been an egg sorting place. So animals had never lived there, but it had lots of barns and sheds. And crucially for his experiment, the family also had a lot of foster children. So he borrowed their barns and he recruited their kids to set up an experiment in which they built locked pens in one of the barns. And they stocked the pens with chickens that could have no contact with each other because they were locked away. And then they fed some of the chickens feed that had no antibiotics in it and some that had been dosed with feed. And then they waited a little while. And then they checked all the chickens. And they documented that in the birds getting feed laced with antibiotics, within just a few weeks, antibiotic-resistant bacteria were arising in their guts and passing out of them in their manure. Then a few weeks later, antibiotic-resistant bacteria appeared in the chickens who were getting drug-free feed, And then a few months after that, in the systems of the farm family as well. So Levy proved two things. First, it was absolute proof that those tiny doses of antibiotics that don't cure an infection affect the gut bacteria of animals that receive them. They turn those bacteria toward resistance, or they increase the proportion of them that are resistant. That solved the mystery of antibiotic-resistant foodborne illness and how it had come to be. Because when animals were slaughtered, when they're disassembled and turned into meat, their gut contents were splashing onto the meat. And the antibiotic-resistant bacteria contained in their guts were traveling with the meat away from the farm into restaurants and into home kitchens and onto plates. But Levy also proved something more subtle that should have been obvious, but no one had thought about it before, which was that the gut contents of those animals was a hazard not just when they were slaughtered, but when they were alive. That resistant bacteria were exiting the animals in their manure, contaminating the farm environment, and flowing away from farms in storm runoff, in groundwater, on the wind, on the feet of animals, rodents, and insects, and eventually even on the skin and the clothing of farm workers themselves. So Levys discovery prompted the United States government to try to act, and this is a really sad episode in this long story. In 1977, the Food and Drug Administration, which had licensed the use of these antibiotics for this purpose 25 years earlier, told the pharma companies that it had made a mistake. It wanted to withdraw those licenses, and it ordered the pharmaceutical companies who were selling growth promoter antibiotics to come to a hearing on Capitol Hill and prove that their drugs did not create a hazard for human health. And the FDA said if the companies could not prove that, they would take those licenses away. The FDA never got to hold that hearing. Prominent congressmen with ties to agricultural interests forced them to back down. They told the White House that if this hearing went ahead, the congressman would hold hostage the entire budget of the FDA. And the FDA backed down. And for 40 years, and I'll tell you why those 40 years end, the US dragged behind the rest of the world in trying to deal with this threat of antibiotics overused on farms. So, England in 1971, the Scandinavian countries in the mid-1980s, all of Europe in 1999, and again in 2005, create bans against overusing antibiotics in a non-therapeutic way on farms. And the United States takes what you would call an empirical route. It waits for evidence. It waits to see what's going to happen. And what happens is something that Alexander Fleming could have predicted, which is that resistant bacteria emerged from overuse of antibiotics. And here are a couple of examples. 1987, hundreds of people fall ill in California from ground beef. The ground beef comes from dairy cattle that were at the end of their milking lives in order to keep them through a few more cycles of producing calves and being milkable. They'd been dosed with the antibiotic chloramphenicol. The antibiotic-resistant bacteria splashed onto their flesh when they were slaughtered and went into the ground beef and into stores. In the 1990s, thousands of Americans fall sick from drug-resistant salmonella, resistant to a particular family called fluoroquinolone antibiotics that have just been brought out. The resistance in that salmonella means that when people went to their doctors for treatment for this foodborne illness, as you would, the drug that their doctors would have reached for no longer worked against this resistant salmonella. If you've ever taken the drug Cipro, you've taken the most common fluoroquinolone. That's what their doctors would have been reaching for. It didn't work anymore. Starting in 2001, two sets of researchers, California and Minnesota, proved independently that bacteria traveling on chicken meat, that were resistant bacteria, were responsible for probably 10% of all the urinary tract infections that occur mostly to women in the United States every year. That's 600,000 to 800,000 cases of UTIs every year traceable back to misuse of antibiotics on farms. Here's just one example of what this looks like. This is a map that was drawn up by the CDC in 2014, and it shows the final case count from just one of these outbreaks. That's 638 cases of drug-resistant salmonella in 29 states and territories, emanating from chicken processed at a single processing plant in California. The CDC estimates that for every case of foodborne illness that's actually identified by a doctor and analyzed in a lab, there are maybe 30 to 40 more that never get detected. That means that what's really showing on this slide, what really was the result of that outbreak, was something more than 20,000 cases of illness in a single outbreak. And outbreaks like this aren't confined to the United States. Here's a few examples. In 2004, the Netherlands experienced a rapid increase of a particular form of drug-resistant staph, MRSA, but MRSA traced to livestock that arose in pigs that had been routinely given tetracycline. That MRSA moved outward from pigs to farm families, to people who had no connection to farms, and then moved into the Dutch healthcare system. It was so devastating that they actually set new infection control standards across the Netherlands, saying that if you were a pig farmer and you went to the hospital, you would be locked into an isolation room until such time as they could prove you were not a threat. In 2015, Chinese and British researchers working together identified that people and pigs and pork being sold in markets in China were all carrying a bacterium that held an identical resistance gene that was resistant to a long-standing antibiotic called colistin. It had been given to the pigs, and that the problem had traveled from the pigs into the meat and then into people. And that resistance gene has now been found in more than 30 countries. So people ask me often when I talk about antibiotic resistance, what is the problem? Why has this gotten so far ahead of us? And one other thing happens behind the scenes of all of these, which is that it's possible that that society didn't take antibiotic resistance seriously because we always assumed that there would always be another drug to counter it, and we were wrong. This is a timeline. It's kind of hard to read, I'm sorry. But since the 1970s, the rate at which new antibiotics come to market has pretty much slowed to a crawl. There's been no truly new antibiotic, not a kind of Me Too improvement or related drug, but one that bacteria have never experienced before in more than 30 years. And the reason for that is because from a pharmaceutical company's point of view, it's actually not in their best interest to make antibiotics. It takes 10 years and $1 billion to bring a new drug to market. The amount of time it takes to make that drug profitable, to earn back that investment, is about 23 years, which is just before your drug becomes generic. As far as pharmaceutical companies are concerned, it makes much more sense to make drugs that people will take every day of their lives. Cancer drugs, insulin, statins. I joke that their best hope of profitability is Viagra, because people will take that every day until their hearts explode. But people only take antibiotics for 2 weeks or maybe a couple of months if they're unlucky. And all the time they're doing that, antibiotic resistance is gaining on their drug. So what does this mean? In the United States right now, the annual death toll, just the deaths from antibiotic resistance, is 23,000 deaths a year. 25,000 in the European Union, 700,000 across the world. And it's predicted that if we can't get this under control, the death toll in just a few years, by 2050, will be 10 million deaths a year from antibiotic resistance. Medicine overuses antibiotics, but agriculture has to take responsibility for part of this, just because the volumes that we use in agriculture are so much greater than the volumes of antibiotics we use in medicine. So because 10 million is a hard thing to wrap your mind around, let me tell you what's contained in that 10 million. Here's what we'd lose if we lose the power of antibiotics. The first people to die would be people who already have vulnerable immune systems. That's cancer patients, patients with HIV, premature babies. Then we lose treatments that install foreign objects in the body because those are targets of infection. That's stents to hold blood vessels open after stroke. That's pumps for diabetes. That's replacement joints for the hips and knees of baby boomers who were part of the first enthusiasm for jogging. There was a study a few years ago that estimated that without antibiotics, among people who get new hip replacements, 1 out of 6 of them would die of infection. We'd lose the ability to perform complex surgeries. We couldn't open some of the hidden spaces of the body until we had antibiotics to protect against infection. No heart operations, no prostate biopsies, no cesarean sections. And finally, and I think back to that ad that I showed you from the 1930s about the danger of cutting yourself shaving, we'd have to fear again problems that seem minor to us because antibiotics made them minor. So strep throat used to cause heart failure. Skin infections led to amputations. Giving birth killed almost 1 woman out of every 100. Pneumonia killed 3 children out of every 10. All of those made unimportant because antibiotics made them safe. The first patient to receive penicillin as an experiment in 1941 was a British police constable named Albert Alexander. He was grievously ill, lesions all over his body. He'd already lost 1 eye to infection. The reason he was so sick is he had gone out into his back garden. Because he was British, he liked to garden, and he scratched his face on a rose bush. And that scratch killed him because there was not yet enough penicillin in the world to treat him for long enough to make the infection go away. So that's where we go when we misuse antibiotics, when we misuse them in medicine, but even more in agriculture. And I want to be sure to remind people that though I've been talking here about chickens and about cattle and about pigs, the problem isn't confined to the land. In some parts of the world, aquaculture, farmed fish and farmed shrimp, rely on antibiotics as well. Here's an example on the west coast of Canada that is where penned salmon farming is common. This is also true in Chile. It's less true in Norway. Norway actually recently took farmed salmon contracts for Costco away from Chile because Chile uses a lot of antibiotics and Norway uses less, and Costco knew that that was what its consumers wanted. The reason all of this is so important is that the consumption of protein is rising around the world, and therefore, unless we change this trend, the overuse of antibiotics will as well. One of the most reliable signals to an economist of when a national economy is improving is that people start to buy more meat. We're so hardwired to like meat and to pursue it that as soon as people get a little income, meat is what they spend it on. So this is hard to read because it's a dense slide, but just look at that overall trend line. This is a prediction from the US Department of Agriculture of how consumption of protein is going to rise in China as China's economy improves. What's true for China is true for India, is true for Brazil, is true for all the emerging economies of the world. They want to buy and eat more meat. There is not enough arable land in the world to raise all those animals on pretty green pastures. These countries are going to turn to intensive livestock agriculture. And unless we can show them a different way, they're going to turn to antibiotics to hold that agriculture up. So the questions, to bring this to a close, are, for the good of the world, can livestock producers change how they raise protein? And can governments change their attitude toward permitting antibiotic use in that protein being raised? And though the story I've been telling you is very dark, I think there is a glimmer of hope here, because I think the answer to both those questions is yes. And here are some examples. In 2014, the chicken company Purdue, that's the 4th largest chicken company in the United States, kind of shocked the rest of its industry when its chairman called a press conference, stood up, and announced that they were going entirely antibiotic-free. In fact, 5 years later, they have reached that goal. They were followed, kind of protestingly, by every other chicken company in America. Tyson and Cargill and Pilgrim's Pride, Foster Farms, they changed the menus at Chick-fil-A and Subway and Taco Bell and McDonald's. And on the other side of the world, in China, in 2016, the Chinese government was so embarrassed by that antibiotic-resistant bacteria spreading around the world from Chinese agriculture that I told you about, that they took the drug that had caused it and banned it from use, taking 8,000 tons of that drug out of Chinese agriculture with the stroke of a pen. And finally, the piece that really was unalloyed good news is that in 2017, in the very last days of the Obama administration, that administration solved the stalemate between the FDA and agriculture and pharma that had existed since 1977, when those congressmen got in the way of reform. On their way out the door, the Obama administration created regulations that made Jukes' growth promoter antibiotics essentially illegal in the United States. It's a little surprising to me. They were followed by Canada just this past year. It's a little surprising to me, after all those decades, that we got where we did, that we finally did, at the very edge of disaster, begin to see reform. And I've spent a long time thinking about why that is. I think it's not actually because of the actions of governments. I think it's because of consumer pressure. Coalitions of chefs and healthcare systems and school systems and eventually even individual parents, backed up by farmers, got together and said that they wanted change. They wanted to see antibiotics not be misused anymore. And I think that pressure, which never existed in Europe because Europe got regulation a long time ago, made it safe for the Obama administration and the Canadian government to act, and made it safe for companies to move because they knew there was a market waiting for them on the other side. So major meat producers and supermarket chains and food service companies in the past 5 years have all renounced at least poultry raised with routine antibiotic use, including some of the largest chains, largest restaurant names in the world. And that's important because it's the big buyers that move markets, that really make change in the world. And I find that so encouraging, but the battle's not over. This is a moment of both great achievement and great fragility. The farm antibiotic control that some nations have achieved covers only growth promoters, mostly doesn't cover that preventive dosing that Jukes also invented. At this point, there's only a handful of countries in the world that actually ban preventive use of antibiotics. Here in the United States, we continue to allow preventive use even when animals are not sick. Just about a year ago, the World Health Organization asked countries around the world to commit to taking preventive use of antibiotics out of their agriculture and to reserving the drugs only for use when livestock are sick. And a number of governments, including the Trump administration, said no. So, this is a problem that will not go away. We know that resistant bacteria move around the world. They move on meat, they move in our bodies, they move in the oceans and on the wind, and they're carried by seabirds. Foods are flown across the world to reach us. People travel and pick up bugs and bring them home. The temptation to place profit over public health is still with us, as it was in the 1950s, when this long mistake of misusing antibiotics began. We have not yet fully reversed that historic mistake. I trust that we will, but we do not have much more time to get it right. Thank you very much. Stephen is on his way to me, but do we have time for people to ask questions? Okay, so Stephen in the back has a microphone, so if you would like to ask me a question, this is all being recorded, so it's important that you speak into the mic. Just put up your hand and someone will bring a mic to you. Keep your hands up so I can see how, hang on just a sec. There was someone up here, is anyone else? Just two, okay, please go ahead.
Great, you got a great voice, by the way. Just to let you know, there was a recall on chicken like yesterday. Tyson and Purdue. You know anything about that?
Say the question again.
A recall on chicken from Purdue and Tyson.
I've been on the road since yesterday, so I haven't seen that news, so I don't know what the problem is. Sorry.
Got you on that. Let me just ask you, what do you know about farm-raised salmon and wild salmon from the Pacific Ocean?
So the problem with farm-raised salmon is that, intrinsically we're raising salmon in ways that they were not, in conditions that they didn't evolve to experience, right? And that's the same thing with industrial scale confinement agriculture. One of the things that makes it possible for salmon to be held in that manner is the use of antibiotics. It shouldn't have to be that we use antibiotics. The very large poultry producers who have moved away from antibiotics have found ways to keep their confinement animals healthy and therefore keep the price of their meat down without using antibiotics by using a number of other things. Now, there's the Atlantic salmon and the Pacific salmon, and I don't know if the conditions are different, but for sure in the Chilean salmon, which is in the Pacific, in warmer waters, they have a real problem with suppressing their antibiotic use. They're seeing a lot of fish diseases when they do in their confinement pens. Norway, with colder waters, has been able to cut antibiotic use. So the question is, what is it in the conditions in which the fish are being raised that requires the use of antibiotics, and are there things that can be substituted instead of antibiotics that will keep the selective pressure on bacteria from antibiotic use from happening? The Burberry scarf up here, and then this lady here.
Thank you. Very eye-opening. My question is, have you, with all of your research that you've done, come across any information about perhaps forward-thinking farmers with the use of probiotics, whether it be, preventative for any bacteria by making the microbiome more effective in fighting them? But
yeah, that's a really great question. So I want to draw a distinction for the purpose of answering between smaller producers who raise in an organic or regenerative or pastured manner and the big industrial scale producers. Because animals that are in a pastured situation are naturally experiencing the microbiome of the place where they are, right? They're chomping on grass and insects and a whole variety of different species. And so they are sort of, with having a natural diet, they are supporting their microbiome in a way that seems intuitive but isn't actually being measured. To turn to the industrial scale producers. When Purdue went antibiotic-free and dragged the rest of the poultry industry with them, they confronted pretty quickly that if they were going to take antibiotics out of the diets of 30,000 chickens at a time raised in a barn with solid walls, they were going to have to do something else, some other supplementation to to support the immune systems of their birds in different ways. So they did a number of interesting things. The first thing they did was they purified the birds' diets. It's not well known that a significant portion of the animals that we eat, when they're slaughtered, a certain portion of that animal is inedible, right? It's bones and collagen and skull and brain and things like that. In a chicken, it can be as much as 50% of the final weight of a chicken, if you include the feathers. All of that gets sold off into an industry called the rendering industry, which renders all of that down into protein and then sells it to the animal feed industry. So Purdue decided that they weren't going to use any more rendered products. They were going to give their birds a pure vegetarian-based diet. That was the first thing they did. The second thing they did was they started vaccinating their chicks a lot more so they'd be less vulnerable to disease and not need preventive antibiotics. Then they gave the birds opportunities to exercise in the barns, perches and things to jump down and flap off. It's really very charming. And they cut windows in the barns so the birds could get sunlight on their feathers, which is an astonishing innovation. It's against decades of practice in the industry. But they also started adding probiotics and prebiotics to the birds' diets. And when you walk into one of their houses now, it kind of smells like a pizzeria, because the things they add to the diets are things like thyme and oregano and yucca and cinnamon and other natural compounds that have a sort of natural sterilizing or antiseptic effect. And all of that together has allowed them to produce antibiotic-free meat at essentially the same price point as they were before. So, exactly what their recipe is, I don't know. I'm sure they keep it proprietary. But that going in the direction of dietary supplementation as a way of supporting the immune system, which is a thing that pastured producers, animals do naturally, is really a big growth industry for the poultry and cattle and hog industries to pursue. Thanks for your question. Over here.
Would you please repeat what was exactly passed by the Obama administration and what was denied by the Trump administration?
Sure.
Thank you.
So to remind, there are 3 uses of antibiotics in livestock, and you can think of them as on a spectrum. At one end, there is giving antibiotics to cure an infection that is obviously present, which is the same way we use antibiotics in people, right? At the other end of the spectrum, there's using antibiotics as growth promoters, which essentially perturbs the gut microbiome and causes animals to get more nutrition out of their feed and to put on tasty muscle mass faster. And then in the middle, there's this mushy category of preventive use in which they give antibiotics to animals to keep them from developing diseases. Giving antibiotics to animals to make them well is always legal and always has been. No one objects to that. It would be a violation of animal welfare not to treat a sick animal. What the Obama administration did was to make functionally illegal. They didn't do it by means of a law, but instead by means of what's called a guidance within the FDA, the other end of the spectrum, that using tiny doses as growth promoters to increase the deposition of muscle on a carcass. What they did not do, and what very few nations have done, is to tackle that mushy middle of using antibiotics preventively, which is still a use that should not occur because it's not using antibiotics it's not using antibiotics to treat an infection that's present. It's using antibiotics to prevent an infection from occurring across the entire flock or herd. After the 2016 election, I think it was in about the end of 2017, the World Health Organization said to all the governments that belong to it, we think it's time to tackle this issue of preventive use. We would like to see your governments move toward banning preventive use of antibiotics as well as growth promotion. And the Trump administration said, no, we're not going to do that. And this should not be a surprise, right? This is a pro-business administration. Any regulation that curbs the ability of businesses to follow their usual business practices is not a thing that this administration is going to be in favor of. So the arc of improvement in agricultural use of antibiotics has essentially stopped. And whether it will continue or not pretty much depends on what the political situation will be over the next 2 or 4 or 10 years. Was that more clear? Great, thank you. I think we need the, okay, we need the mic back?
Are there groups of people or organizations that have actually tied what has been learned about the effects of the preventive vaccinations of animals to what happens with people, with all the preventive vaccinations that we're receiving now and that are in some states for people?
I think what you're asking are there people objecting to vaccination of animals? No. Not to my knowledge, anyway, because they're not the same vaccines, right? So the vaccines about which people are hesitant for children, which are, things like measles and rubella and mumps and whooping cough and so forth, those are not the vaccines that are given to animals. The vaccines that are given to animals are against things like salmonella and E. coli and Marek's disease. So they're very different.
So they're not tying it in any way. They're not making any kind of...
I am not aware of any advocacy against animal vaccination. I hope it doesn't happen, because it's the use of vaccines that is preventing us from having to use antibiotics as much as we did.
Okay, thank you.
I probably have time for, there's one all the way in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I don't know if it's appropriate question here, but maybe you have information. It was a lot of information on the medias, and right now, chicken killed here, transport to China for cheap labor packaging, and get back to States. Mm-hmm. Can you tell something about it? If you know, if it's true or not, how they do it?
So yeah, that's true. It is true that happens. It's true that it's been proposed. And, one of the things that we don't really think about much, probably because the information is not made easily available to us, is how much food that we eat that is processed in some manner moves around the world in its processing. I sat next to someone on a plane once who described how fish, large fish, the fish that are the size of like this podium, that get caught and butchered, essentially cut up into smaller pieces and then breaded and then frozen and then boxed and then end up in the cold case in your supermarket. That those actually travel around the world in the process of being cut up and breaded and returned to us. That they're not all, that doesn't happen like within a couple of miles of wherever the boat lands that has the fish on it. And this happens with a lot of our food, that things move around the world because it's so inexpensive to transport things, and labor is so cheap in the developing world that putting a fish on a boat and sending it to, I will pull a name out of the air, Thailand, and processing it there and shipping it back, all of that process together is less expensive than actually processing the fish and packaging it and transporting it just here in the United States. And that's true, fishes, I'm giving you an example because someone happened to describe that to me, but it's absolutely the case for chicken as well. That's where that permission is coming from, to transport chicken to China and process it and then bring it back. Our defense against something bad happening with this is, we have federal agencies that are supposed to detect when there are problems arising in food that are coming into the country. That's primarily the FDA, under a law called the Food Safety Modernization Act that is now not quite a decade old, I think. But the FDA at the moment is very underfunded, and there's nowhere near enough inspection either in the United States or at the points of origin on the other side of the line of transport to absolutely make sure that we are safe from any contamination happening out of our site. Thanks for your question. I think we have time for one more. Are there any more questions in the room? I am not. No? Yes? Okay, this will be the last question.
You said that everybody has this bad bacteria in their body and your immune system basically can fight it. What about if there is an outbreak? There are people who survive even with this bacteria resistant. What's the secret? I mean, somehow you said about the chicken, you have to have a good diet, exercise, sunshine. What else?
I don't think I understand your question. Try me again.
What makes some people more resistant to bad bacteria than others, even without antibiotics?
Just kind of the magic of our immune system. That, you've probably experienced that, in a class or in a daycare center or in an office, if someone brings in a virus, a cold, something like that, some people seem to be naturally more vulnerable than others. And that's true as well for any kind of infection. There are things we can all do to support our immune systems to make them generally more resilient and less vulnerable to infection, but in the end, it's sort of, it's what medicine would call a host factor. It's all down to the individuality of us.
And also for us, there is this preventing antibiotic, because I just had some dental work done, and the dentist gave me amoxicillin.
So that's true. There are some rare cases in which preventive antibiotics are used in people to prevent infection. If, for instance, you have a heart murmur and you're going to have dental work done that might dislodge bacteria from your teeth that then might go into your bloodstream. Sometimes they're given in advance of prostate biopsies or given in advance of particular surgeries, but that's always on an individual basis. The thing that makes preventive antibiotic use so hazardous for agriculture is it's being given to hundreds and thousands and millions of animals at a time. That's a lot of antibiotic to put into the ecosystem to potentially encourage the adaptation, the evolution of bacteria toward resistance and away from vulnerability to antibiotics. When you're giving antibiotics to a single person at a time, the risk is much, much less. The benefit is increased. The risk is diminished. I think I have to stop here. Thank you all for listening.